And make sure you guys go ahead and accept the stay in the meeting so you don't leave us unexpectedly. Okay, so my name is Michelle Brownstein. I'm the Associate Director of User Experience Research at 352, located in Gainesville, Florida. And I'm also one of the co-organizers of this UX design meetup group for the Gainesville area. So thank you all for coming out today. We do have our meetups the first Tuesday of every month. So thank you guys for coming out on the first of the month this month. It's kind of a typical for us to have it this early in the month, but great to see you all here. I'm pleased to formally introduce this evening Dr. Anne Saville and Dr. Alia DeLong, both UF alumni, Go Gator, and founders of Constructing Equity Consulting, which focuses on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as I said, I'm super excited to have them speak with us today on the topic of inclusionary research methods, because I have seen so many talks about the need for inclusionary research and design, but none about how to actually accomplish that. So just a couple of housekeeping items as I hand off here. I do encourage everybody to go ahead and come onto your cameras so that we can see your lovely faces and we know who we're talking to. But I would ask that you go ahead and try and stay on mute just to avoid any distractions. And we'll ask that you hold your questions to the end, and unless there's a clarifying question, and feel free to drop your questions into the chat and we'll make sure we get to those at the end. So with no further ado, Dr. Saville, Dr. Long, thank you again for joining us, and I will give the floor to you.
Excellent. So I will go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll just add a bit more about us. Beautiful. So as Michelle was saying, I am Dr. Anne Saville, my partner, Dr. Alia DeLong, if you want to wave so we see your face. Beautiful. So we started Constructing Equity over the last year out of our own frustrations of seeing this need unfulfilled, primarily in STEM fields. We both come from natural resource agricultural departments at UF, both critical social scientists, and really just me personally, I won't speak for Alia, but getting really frustrated at just the lack of understanding of race, class, gender, disability, and how those different things interact to create even more complex problems or different experiences. And so we are hopeful and we're really excited for this opportunity. So that way we can, share not only like why these topics are important, but how to actually tap into these different demographics or communities, so that way we are dismantling a lot of really problematic things like white supremacy, heteronormativity, ableism, and creating better experiences and better communities. So with that, being that we are academics, our lovely punny name of combating exclusionary research methods, and we'll talk about why it's important, how to do it, and all the ins and outs. Beautiful. So with that, what does inclusion actually mean? Oftentimes when we think about inclusion, it's more this acknowledgement aspect, right? So we know we need to have people that are from different backgrounds, but what does that actually mean to just acknowledge it? How we see it is acknowledging it doesn't really do anything, right? So we see oftentimes that, when companies are trying to create an inclusive environment, they're like, but we put flags up from all over the world. And it's like, well, what did that actually do to make people feel welcomed or valued? So we really try to differentiate acknowledgement versus valuation and respect. Whereas when we actually value people and based on their identities, we are actually creating a really inclusive environment that is actively dismantling those dominant forms, whether it be heteronormativity, whiteness, male-dominated spaces, those kind of cultural things that serve to exclude people. And that's really important too when we're thinking about research on what does it mean to actually include people. What are our goals? With that, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, inclusion needs to be intersectional. So going back, intersectionality is a huge buzzword right now. You may or may not have heard it. It comes from Black women, feminist spaces, or Black womanhood, and that race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, all of these other identities, insert whatever, come together in very unique ways to change our daily experiences, both at this micro level and at the like larger policy level. So I can simultaneously be oppressed as a like white Jewish woman, but I also experience privilege because of my whiteness and, you know, coming from a middle class background. So how all these different things interact create really unique experiences of oppression and privilege. So we really emphasize this like and or aspect to it. So it's always important when we're thinking about inclusion that it's not just like, okay, we need people of color. Well, what does people of color mean? How does that interact with gender? What does that mean when we are including class and sexuality and everything in between? And most importantly, inclusion, when we do have a really holistic, healthy understanding of inclusion, it leads to not only humanizing these traditionally marginalized and exploited groups, but we actually achieve new understandings of things. We are developing new knowledge and creating a lot of innovation that would have been potentially overlooked without it. So how do we like actively value these different perspectives? It is super imperative as researchers that we really think about what is our intent when we're trying to target these different groups, right? If we have a really vague research goal as to why we are targeting different groups, we're going to have really muddled outcomes and it's not going to actually achieve anything. So we have to be really intentional as researchers as to why do we want these different perspectives and experiences in our research, not just for like the sake of diversity, because that's not actively, helping anybody from a social justice perspective. So making sure that we are very intentional, we are actively recruiting and centering these different experiences. We put a lot of emphasis on the centering aspect because we see a lot in user research or in just research in general, when we do target different demographics, that people feel kind of like an afterthought or like they just want feedback on something, but their input or their experience isn't really critical to the development of these products or technology, whatever it is of the research agenda. So really understanding how to include these voices and centering their perspective. So it's not just a like, cool, you validated what I was already thinking, but actually centering it in your entire research agenda and product development. So with that, I want to talk a little bit more about these different backgrounds or these different demographics and what their experience really means. So starting with BIPOC, BIPOC being this new, acronym that we're seeing all over the place that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. There is lots of debate back and forth whether just, people of color, POC versus BIPOC, the validity of both. For the United States, many people feel that BIPOC is the really important acronym for it because of the history of Black Americans and Indigenous peoples in this country is so unique with both, having experienced enslavement, genocide, insert all the awful, horrific things that we have done to these communities. It's really important to acknowledge that those histories matter. And then just having that we finished, Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, also including just the histories of internment camps that occurred in the West and all those types of histories as well. So with that, history really matters when we're working from this racialized perspective. So that way we know how to be sensitive. We know how to better understand, different cultural nuances and all these racialized contexts. With that, as well as to like why we really want to like center these voices, particularly from this BIPOC perspective, is that technology has, as we have advanced, we have lots of wonderful examples of how like AI technology, for instance, or any other kind of smart tech has turned out to be really racist. We know that like AI tech, like facial recognition doesn't really recognize Black faces very well, leading to like actually, like false identifying people who were nowhere near the crime scenes and whatnot, to more quote unquote innocent racialized events with Google Photos. They were recently I'll say recently, it was like 2015, where their labeling in the Google Photos app identified a whole bunch of Black people in photos as gorillas. and all these other things that have like racialized context as well. Even Zoom with the auto-generated captions are less likely to capture Black voices and accurately capture Black voices compared to their white counterparts. So like those types of things, it's really important to centralize Black culture, Black experience, Black identity through the whole development phase and not just the like after of like, oh, I'm so sorry, we ignored you. Moving on to gender, with gender being the biggest aspect of this is like pronouns and how we actively recruit and create safe, inclusive spaces for people along the entire gendered spectrum. So getting rid of this binary understanding of gender and just the whole pronoun validation of your participants is really important because so much research shows that pronoun or acknowledging someone's pronouns and respecting a person's gender identity is actual suicide prevention. And that's one of the a catalyst for mental health problems, particularly with people that do not identify along the traditional gender binary. So it's not only, you collecting this data, but are you potentially impacting harm onto your participants is why this inclusive perspective is so important. With that, switching on to LGBTQIA, which happy first day of Pride Month. So wonderful time for this. If we are unfamiliar with the entire length of this acronym, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, or asex, as this like full range of all the letters. And for this particularly, it's like why we're included in not only, like having different experiences being so valuable, but it's really to challenge the heteronormativity that is really common in all spaces, right? Heteronormativity is the dominant form when we're thinking about sexual orientation or sexual identity. So by including queer, LGBTQIA participants with this super active recruiting, like centering their voices, it's making sure that our products are, gaming, whatever it is that we're developing isn't inherently disenfranchising or devaluing certain lifestyles. So it's always important that people feel valid and included, and that their experience as LGBTQIA is also not being hypersexualized or fetishized in any way. So moving on, disability, I know that's something that Michelle and I talked a lot in our initial meeting, and this being a big category, right? So with all of these in general, they're not a homogenous group. They all have so much nuance within each of these groups. So it's also really important when we're thinking about recruiting that, it's not just disabled voices, because what does that mean? Are we talking about physical, mental, the whole spectrum of disability? So being really intentional in that aspect. When doing the research for this presentation, something that we noticed a lot is the debate of person first versus identity first language when it comes to disability. And this is where like centering voices of the actual identity is really important, because most activists that are actually disabled, identify as disabled, want identity first language. So what does that mean? That means I am autistic, not I am a person with autism. They really like that identity first language because it does challenge our stigmatization of different disabilities, and it makes them feel more seen and whole. Unfortunately, we often get told, particularly in academic spaces, to do person first and in educational spaces, because that's what the parents of a lot of disabled activists and children wanted, because to them that made it feel less stigmatized and that my child isn't just autistic. However, people like the actual autistic people were like, no, we want identity first. So it's really interesting too, and like when we're thinking about language, where we're getting this information and who it's coming from, because we really want to listen to the people who are representative of the identities of these categories. So that way we're using the best, most inclusive language at all times. So activists' experience is identity first compared to person first when it comes to that. And lastly, we wanted to include class, because going back to that intersectional perspective, especially when we're thinking about language, our class situation growing up, where our parents came from, our education, all matters, and how all of these other identities get filtered when we're using a socioeconomic lens. So especially when we're thinking about language, and say you're actively recruiting for something, and if your language is too academic, you're going to be inherently excluding people that you're trying to help, or like you're trying to get their perspective on, but they just, the language is not accessible. And we can think about that too when it just comes to culture, when we're thinking through this class perspective as well. So really trying to understand all the nuances in these categories, centering these people's perspectives and voices, and also acknowledging that they're not homogenous. Oops. There we go. So this is just kind of like reiterating a lot that we've talked about thus far, and understanding how exclusion happens in user experience research and research at large. So first and foremost, it's really important as researchers that we understand the power dynamics between us and participants. We are always going to inherently have that power dynamic in these spaces. And as researchers, particularly if we're researchers funded by companies, we have more power in these situations. So being really mindful of how that can taint or alter the experience of the participant. So with that, when we need to also think about, so especially too, like as this power dynamic, when we're thinking about the researcher, checking your own identity into this and what biases you might be projecting. Me as a white female, what am I projecting if I'm working with Black women, for instance, or whatever that looks like. Just to be acknowledging our own positionality at all times is important, just so we can get the best experience for the participant and for the data. So with that, other things that end up being huge obstacles for inclusion when it comes to research is even just where the research facility is and the access to it. So if we're using the company property, for instance, like if we're in Atlanta and you're trying to work with lower income communities, you're trying to work with disabled communities, BIPOC communities, and you're in the heart of Atlanta, or in the very upper class areas, what are you doing to help people get to these places? Because if you're not providing lots of alternatives as to how people can participate, you're inherently going to be excluding a large demographic. Same with just the layout of whatever this research facility looks like. Even if you're doing peer review groups, if you have one giant table and a square and a bunch of chairs and it's really narrow, what are you doing for people in wheelchairs or other physical disabilities that are trying to participate? Even just the colors can be really important as well for people with different seeing disabilities, or if people are autistic, and what colors are you using? If it's too bright, because we love colors and everything's really loud and vibrant, that could be really off-putting and traumatizing for a participant. So it's really important to think about who you're bringing into these spaces and what are the potential outcomes for that. So we've talked a little bit already with the language in recruitment, but also just where it's advertised. If we're, advertising in traditionally academic spaces, or even just internet access, we know that there is a large internet gap that exists, particularly in rural America. So what are we doing to try to expand different types of advertising and different ways to get in touch with communities? And lastly, and super importantly, we really want to think about what is our research doing as far as giving back to communities. So Alia will talk about this in a little bit more detail in just a minute, but thinking about, are we essentially exploiting lived experiences, or are we actively creating space for participants to have an active voice in our research and those outcomes? So making sure that it's not just, we always talk about from an academic perspective, exploiting and getting value off of your trauma, but actively, how are we incorporating your view and letting you have some kind of democratic process over what is happening? Excellent. And I'll switch over for Alia.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to turn off my video while I'm talking so that I don't cut out because of my internet. But I just wanted to cover two examples of ways that people can make their research methods more inclusive in user design experience. And so community-based participatory action research is a research method that is based in your target audience. So like Anne was saying, with just hearing what people's experiences are versus rooting your research in people's experiences. So the name kind of spells out what it is. It's community-based and it's participatory. Sometimes it is action research. Action, you're really looking at more of like developing a solution and seeing if that solution works, and then coming back to the drawing board as a community. But ultimately, whatever you call it, what it really comes down to is who has the decision-making part, the decision-making power. So when you're a researcher and you are working with a target audience or a target sample, one way to be inclusive is to think of your target sample as a group you are in a partnership with. So how would you like to be treated if you were in a partnership? So these kind of community and participatory research methods are a way to, they're like a preventative measure so that you're not perpetuating the disparities and inequalities that emerge, as Anne has discussed previously, with different identities and how that can affect an individual's experience. So when you're in a partnership with your audience and your research is rooted in their experiences, you're already taking inclusive steps because you're taking steps not to perpetuate inequalities. And so a couple of important reminders or things to keep in mind. The more knowledge you have when you start, the better. We live in a political world. Everyone's identity is politicized, whether we like it or not. So it's always good to arm yourself with the knowledge of the historical and political context of your target audience, because learning that is not only good for your own political development and education, but it also provides you with a frame of reference for the type of community that you want to work with and be in partnership with. And so if we even take the example of an interview or like focus group questions, for every interview question you develop, you should be asking yourself how the answer to that question will benefit the target community or the underrepresented community that you plan to be in partnership with. Because another part of inclusive research is giving back and the idea of reciprocity. There's a lot of distress between communities who we might look to for participants and researchers because of this top-down experience that has typically exploited vulnerable groups. And I'm sure many people are familiar with one of the most famous examples, which would be the Tuskegee experiments, where Black folks were intentionally withheld treatment to syphilis, and that has had like all sorts of waves in terms of community ethics, but the history is still there. That history is still present today, even if this happened decades ago, because broken trust like that between researchers and the researched has lasting effects. And even more recently, we see it with certain groups not wanting to get vaccinated. And it kind of goes back to the same idea, you know, Black women being involuntarily sterilized or having their tubes tied in the 70s, you know, it still resonates with people today, that distrust of the medical profession. And so people aren't wanting to trust doctors when it comes to making decisions about their health and their body. So when you look at it, it's really not a fear of vaccinations, right? When you really understand that historical context, you can see that the political history matters. So that would be just one example of how knowing the background of specific communities that you might be targeting, can inform the decisions that you make in your current research. Okay, and oh nope, you can stay on the previous slide, Anne. Thanks. Okay, so a lot of times when we talk about reciprocity in research work, the one main way that people tend to accommodate reciprocity in research is through compensation. And this means paying your participants for information. But really, if you want to take that, now I'm not going to downplay compensation. It's very important. If you're asking someone for their time, you should pay them, especially if you're thinking of the research as a partnership or, as something that's collaborative, valuing someone's time, because when a participant takes on the role of, the participant giving you information, they become the expert. They become the expert at their experience. And so experts deserve to be compensated for their time. But other ways are really just to share information with the participants once you have results from your research, or to, let them know personally, even I'm not sure how feasible that is in some cases, but following up with participants to let them know that you made a change based on their feedback with other participants, basically confirming with participants that their voice mattered and that it had an impact. And there are other ways you can act on reciprocity in research. There are many examples, which I won't be able to totally cover today. So with community-based participatory research, if you're unsure, if you're uncomfortable, just keep asking why. And then you might just discover some underlying factor or root cause of inequality. And so now I'll just briefly go over online qualitative research, which is kind of a tangible way to increase diverse audiences for a diverse sample for your research. So typically there are kind of two ends of the spectrum of online research. You have synchronous and asynchronous. So synchronous would be doing an interview on Zoom because you're online, but you're streaming on video, having a live conversation. Whereas asynchronous would be someone keeping a personal journal, or they're posting a blog online. So there's still that online component, but it's not, you don't require them to be online at a certain time to have a certain conversation. So asynchronous would allow for specific groups of people to participate in research when they might not otherwise be available for, say, an interview or a focus group. And this is where class identity really comes into play, because are you scheduling events that are between 9 to 5? You're automatically excluding, everyone in the working class. But really, if you think about shift workers, they have certain schedules that they have to adhere by. So depending even on the time that you schedule a research event, it could automatically exclude certain groups. And so asynchronous research is a way to still value the diverse identities and voices of certain groups while not requiring them to be at a certain place at a certain time. So blocks are just one example. You might have certain project objectives. So a researcher might create a blog post themselves to share with participants, and then participants can interact in the comments, and the researcher can interact with the participants there. I'm sure we're all familiar with forums like Reddit. So you can definitely take advantage of Reddit in terms of posting questions, seeing participants interact with one another in the comments. The researchers can choose to interact with the participants or not. You can observe communications between different people. You can also analyze archival data to answer a question. If you find an archived thread that you think is interesting and might have information that's useful to you. There are also different ways, if you have questions and need an answer, you can do podcasts or like a vlog on YouTube, some kind of asynchronous communication that increases the diversity or the potential diversity of your audience and is a way to accommodate different people's abilities, schedules, stuff like that for audiences that you might otherwise omit from your target sample. And you can also get super creative with this kind of work. You know, there are many ways to elicit information from participants, from developing scenarios, you know, all the way to super structured with just having structured questions that they respond to. But you can definitely get more creative with things like voice and photos and other ways of collecting data that you know, you might not otherwise have in a synchronous form. Okay, so next slide, please. And so this is kind of a little bit of a review of what Anne was talking about earlier, but in the specific context of recruitment. So when you're thinking about the language that you're using when you're looking for participants, are you thinking in the form of a gender binary? Are you unintentionally using language that might be misinterpreted? And a lot of this can be very context specific, and we're always willing to work with different groups or with specific research projects to take a look at that kind of language to see what might be negatively up for interpretation. Also, where you're advertising can obviously impact the kinds of people who are going to participate in your research. Are you getting participants through a marketing firm where you pay a fee and they find you participants? Are you inviting your friends, you know? Probably not inviting your friends, or at least I hope not. But, you know, we should be intentional when we're coming up with a recruitment plan about who exactly will see our advertisement to make sure that there are a variety of venues. And also going back to what Anne said about direction or accessibility of an actual research space, it also should just be good practice that when you invite participants, if it's at a physical location, you let them know where the nearest public transport is, or you're providing rides for people. Just those kinds of accessibility options that people don't automatically think of, but that are important for someone when they're planning to come to participate in your research. Also, again, with your own biases, reflexivity is going to be a huge component of the research process, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But this kind of goes along with who you're inviting, in that are you unintentionally targeting an audience that you don't mean to because they look like you, because they're in your social networks, but instead are you intentionally seeking out people who look different than you, who have different experiences than you, because then you'll be able to recruit a diverse pool of or sample of participants. But a lot of times it's just second nature, you know, that we're interacting with people who look like us. And again, going back to the reciprocity piece, we should always be asking ourselves, how will this benefit our sample population and the group at large? What will they get out of our research results? and if they're not going to benefit from this research, how could they benefit from this research, and how can we incorporate that into our project plan? And so these are just like some different questions or, notes to think about when you're thinking about data collection. Reflexivity, again, when I'm talking about that relationship between a researcher and a participant, that's a power dynamic. And what goes along with that power dynamic is the idea of distrust that I mentioned. So researchers should really be conscious of the way that they are presenting themselves, and making participants comfortable and building trust by being open and transparent with their research project, in terms of, the objectives, the methods, the entire research process. And again, online research or online qualitative research is a good way to provide an alternative way to participate in something that might be a synchronous research, a synchronous research event. So if you have like an interview or a focus group, can you also transfer that same information to a different format? So can you get the same information from different groups, synchronous, in person, asynchronous, which might be a blog or an online forum? Okay. So another important factor is not to project your own insecurities on the recruitment of marginalized groups. So a lot of times researchers in a position of power might not realize that when they're targeting specific groups of people, we're not the helping hand that is going to solve the problem of a community. We need to make sure that we're using that community-based approach where we understand that a person living in their community with their identity is the expert on their experience. And a lot of times researchers might unintentionally project what they perceive as, like a helping hand, but which is actually something that marginalized groups perceive as kind of like an intrusion on their community, because they're looking, well, I won't speak on anyone's behalf, but for researchers, it's important, going back to the idea of partnerships. And that means not top down, not even necessarily bottom up, but having an egalitarian research process. And finally, making sure that the questions that we ask participants are not using like gendered language or like language that can only be understood by an elite class, making sure that the ways that we communicate ideas can be understood by all, because a lot of times academics kind of have a bad reputation for being wordy, because somehow people think that the more flourish you have when you write, the more advanced your ideas. But I can guarantee you that's not the case at all. Sometimes when assigning students like a paper or something, professors will tell their students there's no page requirement, there's no page limit. You take however many pages you need to make your point. And that's pretty much how we should be thinking when we phrase our questions to certain audiences. how clear can you be and how concise can you be? Because if people can't understand your question, then you're going to get multiple interpretations. And so just, ultimately remembering that that language is powerful, obviously, as we have covered, and that you can be inclusive in your research questions by bouncing ideas off of one another. You can test questions on one another. There are different ways to make sure that your language is inclusive in the ways that you need it to be.
So we originally had this activity, but in true academic form, we went longer than anticipated. So we would like to open up for questions or concern, clarification, any of that first. And then if nobody talks, then maybe we can try this out.
I have one to get us started. So you mentioned kind of bouncing the wording that you have off of each other. It's definitely hard to catch your own biases, right? Whether it's your heteronormative or any real bias that you have, it's hard to kind of catch it yourself. So I'm curious, for people who are a UX team of one, how would you recommend kind of accomplishing that same goal when you don't really have a team to bounce off of?
Yeah, absolutely. So what a lot of qualitative or grounded theory researchers talk about is basically journaling. And anytime you collect data, kind of taking that moment afterwards and just write down your initial thoughts that you're projecting onto what just happened. And that way you can kind of take a step back and look through that again. You can be like, ooh, okay, the more I've read, the more I've thought about it, I can now see that those initial thoughts were actually, my straight perspective of what this should look like, or insert whatever. And then doing that really often is how we can kind of practice that reflexivity and kind of check in with what is going on in our own selves.
Also, another really, I think, underutilized tactic is to ask someone totally unrelated to your field who has no idea what you're doing. Ask them a question and ask them how they would answer it. Or if you have a set of questions, send it to someone who's totally outside of your field and ask them, what do you think I'm trying to accomplish by asking these questions? And I guarantee they'll give you a ton of feedback that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of.
See, Helene?
Yes, I am a volunteer and I have to recruit some people to interview, and I have small success. Just a little ones or two coming to be interviewed. My question is, how can I offer for them? Because I am volunteer, so all the team are volunteer. I don't know how to start with give something for them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally had that same experience in my own doctorate research. That's working with a very new advisor. We had zero idea that we actually had funds. So I did everything out of pocket for all of my research. So I fully understand. And what helped me the most, and obviously this will change depending on what your research topic is, or what you're trying to get at essentially, but basically going back to that community approach where I went in being I can't offer you anything, because for this particular group they wanted healthcare, and especially as a graduate student I was like, I can't do that, but what can I do? And that is consciousness raising, or helping them out in their own activism, or talking about it more often, so that way people are aware of this current group situation. So asking what the community wants that you're trying to target, and have those conversations to kind of negotiate a little bit. It is time consuming. It does require a lot of that community trust building. which particularly as volunteers, you may not have that emotional capacity to do so. But even if you tap in with, so this is going to be something that I wanted to bring up too, on like other recruitment pathways, is finding nonprofits that are already doing, like working with these groups. So for instance, if you're trying to understand the user experience on, you know, insert whatever for a population that has lupus, find a local chapter of the lupus or the American Foundation for Lupus. And that's already kind of that gatekeeping a little bit that can help you get into a community that shows that you have validity. And that way you can kind of work with somebody to figure out what's the best way to provide back, if that makes sense a little bit. So kind of finding like more roundabout ways to provide things back to the community than like just money or like just immediate outcomes. It might be a little bit more abstract in what you can offer. I don't know, Leah, if you have more insight into that.
Yeah, I would say sometimes it depends on the community, but you know, obviously funding is limited. We don't always have tons of money to just pay people and to, you know, invite them to come give their voice. But if you have a plan up front where you show them how you're going to give back to the community and how their information will help develop this product. A lot of times, if you involve participants in the dissemination of your research, then they have a reason to be engaged and to, you know, stay involved in the project, stay around, even if there's no payment involved. And there are tons of different creative ways that researchers have come up with as, you know, results dissemination among research projects, which could be like making a community play. Like obviously this is totally dependent on the context of a project, but you know, if a community wants to disseminate results to their community and they want to do it in a particular way that's creative, that can be a way to kind of start that conversation. But again, I would have to know a little bit more about the context.
Excellent. So I see Mark's question in the chat. How does user research who shares the same experience as the underrepresented group check their own bias? Yeah, so a lot of the same tactics still apply that we talked about earlier of like getting outside input or doing that journaling process. And you know, if particularly since you're sharing that same experience, to me, that makes it sound like the research could like is automatically, not like automatically, but it could be more inclusive inherently because you're already knowing what to look out for. Or look, you know, you might be able to better understand kind of those traps and pitfalls that we talked about earlier and provide more insight. But just definitely going through like getting another person's perspective or going through that journaling process can help make sure that you're actually like centering somebody else's experiences and not just projecting your own experience into that person. You know, regardless of sharing the identity or not, it's just always good to be mindful when it comes to that in all capacities.
I had a question. So I'm a UX writer. That's kind of my focus within UX. And so I really appreciate you talking about how all of this applies to the way we think about language in UX design. And I was wondering if you had some suggestions for how to navigate differences of preference in, like you were talking about, identity first language versus other ways that different marginalized groups or underrepresented groups might prefer to talk about themselves or identify themselves. What are some ways to navigate differences of preference within those communities when there's not, you know, necessarily one right answer?
Leah, do you want to dive in? Yeah.
I was thinking, like, I'm thinking specifically in terms of saying people of color or BIPOC. Like, if you can like be as specific as possible, that's usually what I think of. You know, if you're talking about Black people, say Black people. You know, if you're talking about people of color in a broader sense, like the real concern, I try not to get too bogged down in the kind of pedantics of language if it's not offending someone. You know, like we're not, like I'm not going to repeat you know, poor language that people use, you know, but nobody is perfect. We're certainly not perfect. We're learning all of the time. And we use language that, you know, is the most current for us at this time. And, you know, when in doubt, like really any activist group will have like a how-to guide on ways to navigate language. And there are a lot of really good groups out there. Like what's that? The Red Umbrella, is that what they're called? You know, they're like sex worker activists. So if you ever talk about that topic and need ways to navigate that kind of language, you know, activists have a lot of good content out there.
Yeah, definitely refer back to activists. Look who the activists are, because that, going back to the example that you brought up with identity first versus person first, is it the parents of these people and they're advocating for it, or is it the actual people of this group? Obviously there's going to be differences like you mentioned, but you know, your gut does tell you what's right most of the time too. So don't over outthink yourself. I see Stacy's comment in the, of course, thank you. On focus groups, is it possible to moderate a focus group inclusively?
I had a thought about that.
Yeah, I was.
So part of the expertise that I contribute to consulting equities, my experience as a grassroots feminist activist. And when we have discussions, we use something called progressive stack. And so think about how if you're having a discussion in a group of people, say it's a classroom and people are raising your hands and you do them in the order of when they raise their hand. Progressive stack is you move people with less heard identities to the top of the stack. And that it's especially true when you're talking about a specific issue that might be race. So if you're talking about Black power, you'll want to use progressive stack to let the Black woman speak first, even if a white woman raised their hand first, you know, because they don't have that experience and that identity and that expertise. And so that was the first thing that came to mind as the way to moderate a focus group inclusively, is you're prioritizing those voices that aren't normally given priority, and therefore giving voice to ideas that are not the norm and not the status quo, but against it.
And really staying true to that as well. There's a ton of research, particularly in higher ed spaces, that male students felt that their women counterpart monopolized the classroom when they spoke more than 15% of the time. And so like being mindful that you're going to really piss people off, and that is okay, because we need to get to those other voices and we need to make sure they're valued and included. And it's not just that acknowledging thing that we talked about at the very beginning, but that they're actually respected, and we're dismantling this space to, you know, not automatically be white male or whatever that looks like. So it's good to piss some people off on occasion.
I have a question about compensation. So this is always a prickly pear for the projects that I work on. We worked on a project that was all about trying to get people out of debt, and we gave them an Amazon gift card, and it just felt like, what are we doing here? You know, let's give them money they could actually use to get out of debt. You know, they could apply to their bills, whatever. But the logistics of getting that money was so difficult. We ended up just going with an Amazon gift card because it was fairly ubiquitous. But of course, it runs into limitations because people, you know, have to have a credit card in order to, you know, pay for the shipping or whatever they bought or and whatnot. And so, you know, we'd considered doing a check. Well, a check requires them to either have a bank or to go someplace that's going to cash their check. And of course, they lose a chunk of the money that way. Prepaid cards, you know, they still have to be able to use a credit card. They have to have internet access for some things. You know, it's limiting. You can't use it at a restaurant or a gas station because, you know, it maxes out a certain amount. So we kind of ran into this issue of trying to determine the best kind of compensation for this wider SES diverse group. And it really just came up short. I'm curious if you guys have any perspectives on better types of reciprocity in terms of, you know, actual compensation that we can accomplish for those types of situations.
I mean, when so my research, it was with farmers. And so if you offer a farmer an Amazon gift card, they're going to be like, okay, like $150 on Amazon. Like, I never used Amazon, but I really would like to pay my electricity bill. And I just, when you ask them what they want, they'll tell you, you know, that's really what it came down to. And what they want is cash. I don't know if that's possible, but I mean, that's like the simplest way to go. But it also comes with its caveats because you can lose it.
Yeah. So I'm curious, in that circumstance, how did you get them the cash? Was it actually like dollar bills? Was it a check? Like,
Well, I worked
how
at the
does that?
university. So, you know, I had their whole treasury management system to go through, but yes, dollar bills.
Nice. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions, final thoughts, comments as we're approaching the end of our hour?
Okay.
Before our final, we're gonna skip our final thoughts, but I do want to share all of our information should you choose and or like to follow up. Our Instagram is Constructing Equity, and our lovely intern Nathan is on our call. So all of the social media that you see is directly coming from him. And we definitely want to acknowledge all of his greatness. So we would love a follow there. Of course, our website and our email. If at any point you have follow-up questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, anything you need, we are always happy to help and definitely want to make sure that you'll all get the best experience, you know, as researchers, in addition to your participants having the best experience as well.
Awesome. Dr. Saville, Dr. DeLong, thank you guys both so much for your time this evening. Thank you all for coming out and joining us and providing some great follow-up questions. Sorry we didn't get around to your workshop, but hopefully we can have you back another time. Thank you again, everyone. This is the end of our meetup. Our next meetup will be on July 6th, and we'll be hearing from Anna Lepare. I'm hoping I'm saying her name correctly, but she works with Walters Corporation, and she'll be speaking on capturing and interpreting the voice of the customer. So thank you all again. Everyone stay safe. Hopefully we'll see you next month. Bye all.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.